Hey, what's up, guys? I read a book recently called A Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, and it's an absolutely fantastic book, and I had to share it because it's got me thinking a lot recently, a lot more so than most books normally do. It's a book that is relatively well known. It's often compared to 1984, which is a comparison I disagree with. I think that's like comparing Batman to the Joker and saying they're both criminals. Superficially, they're both criminals, but the intent by which they commit crimes is very different. And the intent by which the future they rule is perpetrated is very different, and it defines a brave new world. Now, Brave New World is set in the future. It's supposed to be a utopian society, and what the government in this book is trying to do is essentially eradicate unpleasantness, make everything happy all the time. And what the society is like, it's a society where people are born in a laboratory. So the beginning of the Matrix movie, it reminded me very much of the beginning of this book. I wouldn't be surprised if they had read this book. It's a society where everyone's very promiscuous, there's absolutely no suffering, and outside of their job, there is no responsibility. There's nothing to worry about. And in this book, it basically explores whether this is a good or a bad thing. It compares it to an old society, and I won't give away too much of the book, but in the book there is another society that exists that's called Savage Reservation. And on the Savage Reservation, people live as nomadic Indians. So why do people consider this to be a dystopian future? Well, the main reason is because there is basically no feeling, there's no meaning. And I think this can be summarized by one of the characters in the book called the Controller. And I won't really explain too much about him, but he says something that I think is very profound. He says that happiness, or not happiness, but feeling is the interval between desire and the consumption of that desire. And I think that really explains the perceived dystopian nature of this book. This book compares these two societies. In the modern society, there is nothing to worry about. Everything is happy. It's very much aided by a drug called soma. Actually, I should probably go into that very quickly. The soma, when you read about it, it basically reminds you of the effects of MDMA. And in fact, if you were to take a music festival like Ultra or EDC, if you've ever been to one, basically the spirit, the way that people act, the characters that you would run into there, it's basically what a Brave New World is like. Instead, you just take one of those music festivals and extrapolate it up to an entire society. That's exactly what that world is like. And a lot of people consider it to be very frivolous, and that is basically what happens with one of the characters in this book. He lives in the futuristic society, and he's just not content with it because of the lack of feeling. He doesn't know what it is yet because he was born in a society. They don't know about that kind of stuff. But he doesn't have a sense of meaning and feelings. He doesn't know how to reconcile those. So he ends up going to the reservation and exploring these ideas. Now, one of the main reasons I disagree with the fact that it is a dystopian future is because if you compare it to the past society, which is what this book does, the past society has all of these things that are very ugly, that people want to get rid of, that are striving to get rid of. And they're really, when you boil it down empirically, they're after the same thing. They're after being happy, after contentedness, meaning. And these two societies simply go about achieving these things in a different way. In the old society, just having something to eat, having shelter, things like that is very significant. In the modern society, not so much. All the food is taken care of. Everything is produced on an industrial scale. There's somas. They're never sad. They never age. They don't know what that's like. So they just don't have any problems. And what the government is just trying to do is just create this seamless user experience throughout the person in the civilization's lifetime to make sure they are happy at all times and that they are never sad. Where in the old society, they're trying to do the same thing, but the difference is they have to struggle for it, and that's what gives them meaning and feeling. And I think, again, the Controller says something very interesting. In this book, there are a lot of different things they talk about. They talk about freedom, they talk about knowledge, they talk about wisdom. But I'm just going to keep it just to this basic idea. The Controller gets into an argument with the character. I won't give away what happens in the story. They're talking about they're basically comparing and contrasting the different societies. The new society doesn't have Shakespeare, doesn't have basically a lot of the things that we now associate with meaning and feeling and entertainment. It's very different. So they get into argument on why these things are there or why these things are not there, these different things. And really what it boils down to, these two get in an argument, is what the controller says, because what the society is trying to do is eliminate all these unpleasantries. It says, well, if you don't like the society, basically what you're arguing for is the right to be miserable, the right to suffer. Because as what he said before, feeling is the interval between desire and satisfaction of that desire. So what the society is doing is just scientifically narrowing that gap until it's almost nothing. So when you do that, then there is almost no feeling. So if you want to have feeling, there needs to be a gap. And what that gap between desire and the consumption of desire, that is known as suffering or pain. And that distance is the amount of suffering and pain. So I think it's a bit hypocritical to criticize that type of society and say that it is bad, because it is simply a society. And it is not because of what they're doing that makes it bad. What they're complaining about is a lack of meaning. And the lack of meaning is because they're getting everything they want. So really what the book highlights is the brokenness of human beings. Not really brokenness, but maybe just the tools that it is still using that it no longer strictly needs. So if you think about feelings are a tool to navigate the environment. The reason you feel pain is because otherwise you would just walk into a fire, or there would be no reason to avoid a hungry lion. And other types of feelings have different purposes. The feelings are there to help guide the creature to survive and to reproduce. That's all the feelings. They're all based on one of those two things, essentially. So when eliminating those feelings, you're basically eliminating a lot of the purpose. You're basically eliminating the whole that whole construct. And it's very difficult for the people to reconcile. So I don't think it's necessarily anything wrong with the society. All they're doing is they're doing something, I guess, quite, if you think about it, it's quite reasonable. It's what people in today's society are doing. Today's society is simply a limbo between the future of instant gratification and the past where you had to work damn hard to do it, where it was a very big deal, it's very gratifying just to have food. I've never heard today of people starving themselves intentionally to make food taste better, but I can assure you, as someone who's gone camping for a long time and we ran out of food, that being hungry and then coming to eat is one of the best feelings in the world, but I've never starved myself to intentionally feel that. So what the controller says, I think, is very accurate. If you're not doing that, then what you're arguing for is suffering, and then you can accept the consequences of that, is what he says to this person. But that is what you're doing. You're demanding the right to suffer. So I think it's very interesting, and that's why I don't think it's necessarily fair to call it a dystopian future. There's a dystopian past, which people don't want to be a part of. They say, well, that's too much. The future, they say, well, that doesn't have enough meaning. So all people are arguing about is just what is the right amount of suffering. They're saying, well, this amount of suffering in our time is a pretty good amount, maybe a little bit less. But then, of course, then you get to those people, then it's a little bit less. I'm sure to people in the past, we're living a dystopian future right now. They don't even know the value of food or all of these things that we take for granted. I guess to a certain extent, you can kind of see the difference even now between sort of city people or country people and city people. It's slightly different. Now that's what I think all it really is. So I don't really think it's a dystopian future. The reason it's dystopian is because we have a dystopian past, we have a dystopian present, so therefore we'll have a dystopian future. As long as people exist, I can guarantee you, no matter what time period they live in, it will be dystopian, because that's by very nature, due to the biological machinery that they evolved from. That is the nature of which they must be deprived in order to feel satisfaction. And that's just the way it is. And all this place is doing is just trying to narrow that as much as possible. And to say that it's bad or good, who knows? I don't think it's bad or good. It's probably neutral. It's simply a future. And in fact, I think it's rather interesting that people would argue that this particular society in the book is evil or cruel, because, to be honest, I think the the best character in the book is the controller, and the most understanding, and the only truly character that is not doing something for his own interest. Every other character in the book eventually ends up doing what they think is right. They end up pursuing their own selfish interests. The controller is the only one who ends up not doing that, and you'll see what I mean in the book. And in the end, well, I don't really want to give it away, but just look to the end where he's actually quite a reasonable person and is really trying to do his best to accommodate everyone. And that's basically what his government is about. It's about keeping everyone as happy as possible for as long as possible, as quickly and efficiently as possible. And that's what the society is about. And that is what our society is moving towards. And to say so otherwise, I think is really misleading. So that's what I think about the book. I think it really sums it up quite nicely in the words of the controller as well, when they're arguing about the feelings, about what is missing in the society, feelings, stuff like that. So one of the people is arguing that there's no feeling, there's no nobility, there's no heroism. And the controller, I think, responds very well. What he says is, nobility and heroism are simply symptoms of political inefficiency, and to some respects, scientific inefficiency as well. So if you live in a world where there is no bigotry, there's no inequality, there's peace, there's no aging, there's nothing to worry about, how can one be noble? How can one be heroic? I would say and argue that it's impossible. So, a very interesting read, a lot of very interesting characters. Some aspects about the book that I found very interesting is that you're always changing between the two societies and whose side you're on. You start off against the futuristic society, yes, it's very frivolous and such. Then you go to the savage reservation, you see how brutal things are, and then you change sides again. And then you're constantly changing, and I think really what it says, it really highlights the fact that it's very hard to come up with a right answer of, is that wrong or is that right? Just because of the very broken nature of human beings. They're fixing themselves because they themselves have deprivations, and basically all they're doing is just satisfying that need that wouldn't otherwise exist if they did not exist. So it's very, very interesting. All the characters, and because of that very nature, I think that it's very hard to say that there is a protagonist and antagonist. I think a lot of people would say that the controller is the antagonist. But I think that it's hard to say who the protagonist is. I would say that every character is their own protagonist and their own antagonist because of the very nature of their desire. It's self-deprecating. They want to make themselves suffer so they can feel. But in order to feel, they must suffer. They must be deprived. So, very interesting book. It's a little bit slow to start. The first time I tried to read this a few years ago, I didn't make it past the first 20 pages. I thought it was pretty boring. But after you make it past the first chapter is simply going through the laboratory, which is the test tube, where they grow the children and such. I think that's a little bit boring to me because I think it suffers a little bit in the beginning, like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, where at the time of the writing, this was like a really futuristic idea. Nothing had never happened yet. Like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, no one knew what was under the ocean for a long time. So it was really interesting, everything they talked about, all the fish and the octopuses and stuff like that. But now since you just go on the internet and look at it, it's not so interesting. So if you make it past the first 30 pages, it picks up very quickly. And once you make it to the Savage Reservation, honestly, I couldn't put the book down at that point. So if you're interested in further discussing this book, I'm up for it. There's a lot of very interesting sub-points that it's talked about. Like I said, freedom, knowledge, wisdom, all these other things. How much is good? How much is bad? What should it be doing in the context of the society? But of course, on each one of these topics, you could devote an entire career and still not come up with an answer to those questions. So if you want to continue the discussion, just comment, make a response. I'll try to keep it on one of the topics, otherwise it just becomes too much. But excellent book. Give it a read if you've never read it. First few pages are a little bit tough to get through because it's like reading about cars now. If you passed it would have been interesting. And I think it could have done without the last chapter. I felt the point was made in the chapter before, but you can decide for yourself. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll see you next time.